Today we'd like to talk about cycles, and cycles are actually based upon numbers. And so first we're going to talk a little bit about numbers and what numbers are, because we find that many people don't understand mathematics because no one ever taught them the rudiments. It's very simple, and yet they think it's so simple that they don't teach it, perhaps, or who knows why. But anyway, perhaps they do nowadays, but they didn't when I was growing up. And the numbers are basically, you have count. It's a count of something. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items, whatever they are, 5 bushels of wheat, or 5 ears of corn, or 6 apples. So that's count, and that's how numbers started off, with counting. And on the opposite side, you have numbers that are used for measurement, and that's a bit different when you're measuring something. And we'll get to that in a little bit, the difference, because that's very important, the difference between the two. And so when we're talking about cycles, we're talking about count, the count of the cycles. And so a count, actually, when you're counting, there's 2 aspects of count. And one is called cardinal, which is just basically you're counting numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so forth. And the other aspect of that is the ordinal. It's called ordinal numbers. Ordinal just means that there's an order to them. And so you say first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. When there's an overlap between the ordinals and the cardinals, then we know that when we say, for example, the first cycle, that's the same thing as saying that's cycle number 1, or the second cycle, that's cycle number 2. Third cycle, cycle number 3, because there's a one-to-one correspondence between first and being a count of 1, and the second cycle being a count of 2. There's a one-to-one correspondence, 1 to first, 2 to second, 3 to third. And now ordinal numbers can have more than that. You can have, like, first place at a fair, at a county fair. You could have the best apple pie. Okay, so you get first place, second place, and third place, and that's ordered. It's their ranks, and then you might have honorable mention, but they don't necessarily tell you how many contestants there are, or anything like that. It's just a matter of rank. And it might be, like, for example, honorable mentions. In that rank, you might have more than one, so it's more than a one-to-one correspondence. Yeah, first place, a one-to-one correspondence. First place, highest rank. Second place, 1, next highest rank. Or there could even be ties, so sometimes you have 2 in a particular category. In an honorable mention, yeah, sometimes you have several. So So when we're talking about cycles, we're talking about the cardinality of it and the ordinality in a one-to-one correspondence. When we apply cycles to dates, now we're bringing measurement into the picture. So that, what exactly is measurement? Now, measurement measurement has 2 things. It has boundaries, and it has proportionality. Now, what do we mean by boundaries? By boundaries means that if you're going to measure something, you have to have a starting place, and that starting place is 0. We know it as 0, or if you're counting, it's a none. But when you're counting, you normally don't start with 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, because there's no need to. You just say there's 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, 4 apple. So you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4. And so where do you start with counting numbers? You start with 1. And that's what we would do with cycles. The first cycle, the second cycle, the third cycle, the fourth cycle. But when we're measuring, Because if we say, well, a cycle ran from 1849 to 1850, summer 1849 to summer of 1850, June solstice 49 to June solstice 1850. Well, that's 1 year. So, so now what you're doing is you're measuring. Now, when you measure, the other thing that you have to have with the proportion, you have to have unit, because when you measure by units, how many units of something. And so you can measure how many apples are in a bushel. Okay, you count out the apples, and then you know how many apples are in a bushel. And if the bushel is only half full, you can know how many apples that is. That's a proportionality, 1/2 compared to the full thing. So that's the proportionality part of measurement. You can get whole numbers and then a part of a number, and or it's partly filled. Something is partly filled. That's measurement. And so, but measurement starts with a 0. You can't start with year 1. You start with year 0, your base. And so, for Cosmin, in the Cosmin era, 1849, June solstice 1849, we take as the beginning of the Cosmin era. And so the year that runs from June 1849 to June 1850, that is year 0. It's not year 1. Actually, it is year 1 if you're counting. Yes, it's the first year. But if you're measuring, we say, well, that's year 0. Because if you start on a timeline and work forward from the timeline, you can't start with year 1. I'll show you an example here in this chart. Now, in this chart, over here, we have, this is a chart of light and darkness for the first 200 years of the Cosmin era. And we'll note over here that this line here, this vertical line, up here is light and below is darkness. And these are the measures of light as a millage. And a millage is like percentage, only it's out of 1,000. And so it goes up by increments of 100, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600. And it goes down into darkness, that many, 600. And that's all that was necessary for this to show the first 200 years of Cosmin cycle. But the point we were making right now, though, is you have to start with year 0, and then you go out to the first measure, and that first measure that we see there is 5. 5 AK, mean Anno Cosmin, the 5th year of Cosmin, 5th year basically after Cosmin. And so what the measure does is it starts with 0, and you finish the first 5 years. That's the measure of the first 5 years is 5 years. It takes 5 years, but the reason that you do it that way is because then you start with your base year, which is 1849, and then you just subtract that. You subtract whatever year you're looking at, you subtract 1849 from it to find what year you're talking about.